Missouri lawmaker wants the state's charter schools to be more accountable to the public.
And there are bills to allow them in more parts of the state, not just Kansas City or St. Louis.
Joe McLean gives us a breakdown of the policy that's stirring up some controversy.
There are 81 charter schools operating in Missouri right now, and collectively they receive more than $60 million in state funding. But these aren't like your regular public schools because they're not under the authority of the local school boards that you elect. That's what one Democrat wants to change.
The legislature has fallen short of our constitutional mandate as stewards of public education.
State Representative Doug Clemens' bill would require all charter schools be accountable to the State Board of Education and the locally elected school board, just like public schools. Right now, charter schools are governed by the Charter School Commission, which, as Clemens points out, has unelected members, mainly from areas that don't actually have charters in them.
While charter schools can be an innovative idea, they must be held accountable to local parents and meet the same minimum standards that any public school is held accountable for under law and regulation, including stewardship of our tax dollars.
Representative Clemens spoke about his bill Monday, joined by his brother Byron Clemens, who is an organizer with the American Federation of Teachers.
It's really a Department of Redundancy department. It's repetitive, redundant, not necessary. Let's return the power to DESE.
Opponents say charter schools have turned from a place to experiment with educational solutions to a monetization of a vital public resource. Supporters of charter schools, though, say they provide more options for a community, particularly one with a poorly performing public school.
I in no way, shape, or form want to change where charter schools are at as far as they've earned that right to be there. They seem to have a lot of folks interested in attending those schools.
Republican State Representative Brad Pollitt chairs the Education Committee.
I think we should probably look at the ability for the traditional public schools to not have as many regulations that they have on them.
Clemens said he's not against charter schools as long as they're accountable to the public. In Jefferson City, Joe McLean, KY3 News.